In today's video, we're going to canvass all of the thorny issues that I can think of, at least, concerning getting your pride and joy, that vehicle that you love, and putting it on ice for a protracted period, like a couple of years. How do you stop the second law of thermodynamics from reaching in and pulling your pride and joy's pants down, metaphorically, and then doing all kinds of unspeakable things to it, chemically and mechanically? That's next. Today's video is inspired by an dude just like you named Craig from Canberra, who's going to do exactly that with not one, but two cars. Dude. Craig says, in several weeks, I'm being deployed overseas for a couple of years, and so I'm going to put my cars away. Those cars, incidentally, are a 2017 Holden VF SSV Redline Commodore. So that's got an LS3 in it, and his is a 6-speed manual, so... and also, even better perhaps, a 1976 Holden LX Tirana SS. And it is a 5-litre 4-speed manual. So fair to say that Craig is fair dinkum 1-0 us. And he is at that crossroads because those cars are a dead set classic and an imminent dead set classic, and you wouldn't want to put them on ice and sort of just ruin them or make the recovery worse than it has to be. So I'm going to go through Craig's stream of consciousness, which he emailed me. It's like kind of this long. But if you're going to put a car on ice, do not do it without at least thinking about these issues and making a freaking logical, rational, sort of critically thought out decision. This report is sponsored by NordVPN. Get a mega discount plus 4 extra months of Nord for free now in my exclusive deal. Go to nordvpn.com/AEJC. Online security threats are everywhere, but you don't have to be the next victim. That's where NordVPN comes in, locking everything down securely in the background. Go to nordvpn.com/AEJC now. Every 2-year NordVPN plan receives that mega discount with the 4 free months and a bonus Amazon gift card on the Plus and Complete Nord packages for a limited time only. nordvpn.com/AEJC. Using NordVPN is easy. Just subscribe, download the app and connect. 1 click later, your IP address is shielded and your traffic is encrypted across as many as 6 of your devices. Nord is the fastest VPN on the planet. It costs only about as much as a single cup of coffee every month to keep your data, your identity, and your devices secure. Masking your location means you'll be able to access content that might be blocked where you live. Plus, you can continue to watch your favourite content when you travel. Boost your online security at nordvpn.com/AEJC now. Get that mega discount, enjoy those extra 4 months, plus the free Amazon gift card with the Plus and Complete packages for a limited time. It's all totally risk-free with Nord's rock-solid 30-day money-back guarantee. It's easy to stay safe online. Visit nordvpn.com/AEJC now. So Craig has a lengthy stream of consciousness here, and dude, it is lengthy, but we are going to go through it because I think a lot of people think this way about their cars. It's not quite as critically as possible, I'd suggest, and what we're going to do is basically get stream of consciousness and pass it through the filter of applied physics and chemistry and see if a sensible approach doesn't just drip out of this process's anus, right? And if you are ever faced with the prospect of mothballing a car, putting it on ice, whatever, for a protracted period, then maybe you can do it sensibly. That's the objective here. But I want to go through the thought process, basically, and we need to start with Crago. And Crago has essentially double dead dingoes donga dared me to read out his missive in a funny voice. And, dude, here to help. So Craig goes, on the Tirana, I think I'm pretty good. It will stay at home in the garage. Gararge, the French one. The garage, where I can keep the battery charged and one of my boys can at least start and warm it up each month, including putting fresh fuel into it as needed. How much fresh fuel do you think it might need, Craig, when one of the quote-unquote boys is just warming it up once a month? I'd suggest a far more likely scenario. Knowing what I know about young blokes everywhere, particularly if dad is a total car perv, it's more likely to be that Ferrari 250 GT California Spider event from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Like, it's going to be the mad thrash through the boonies, culminating perhaps in, I don't know, Summernats burnout competition or something of that nature. It'll certainly need some fresh fuel when it's subjected to this kind of quote-unquote maintenance program, won't it? So, yeah. Craig continues and says, on the Commodore, I'm not so good. Of course, I've Googled the crap out of the subject, and I've squared away a lot of common items like sealing the inlet and exhaust against rodents. God knows there's plenty of rodents where Craig lives too. I mean, Parliament House is just there, isn't it? Cleaning and covering the exterior, cleaning the interior thoroughly. Thougly. I didn't realise spell checker was still extra, like pearl finish or something. Including throwing in some of those desiccant pouches inside the cabin and boot. Well, I'd suggest that, that silicon desiccant crap, it's probably not going to be that effective over 2 years, is it? Because once the silicon gets saturated with moisture, right? So I wouldn't bother about the desiccant, but I would try and store it in as dry an environment as possible. I think that makes reasonable sense. So probably not out the back under a deciduous tree, for example. Cleaning the interior thoroughly, Thougly, including throwing some of those desiccant pouches inside the cabin and boot, leaving the car unlocked but windows up, and removing anything and everything that is important to the car, service books and the manual. There remain 3 issues that have me lost. Okay, well, I'm dying to know what these 3 issues are, Craig. Craig says, there is certainly a lot of opinion out there on the web, but it seems those opinions are polar. Go figure. Conflict being so important to discourse online. If you say A, I say B automatically. That's how online discussions work, isn't it? Nobody gives anyone the benefit of the frickin' doubt. And seemingly have little in the way of evidence-based position for me to land upon. Yes, it is a very short runway and you're coming in hot, aren't you, when it comes to getting advice from Redman222 on Reddit. And so I'm wondering if you might give me your thoughts, please, anticipating your ability to objectively step through. Don't split the friggin' infinitive, okay? To objectively step through. Objectively to step through, come on. Your pros and cons, with apostrophes, of fucking course. In order to remove the conjecture, I'll try not to be a complete coward and arrived at a place for each issue. I'm looking forward to your ridicule of my thought process. It's a pleasure, dude. If it helps, my plan is to rent a garage at a storage facility for the Commodore, and so I anticipate there being a concrete floor, a somewhat sealed roller door, and maybe even a PowerPoint available. Imagine that. PowerPoint. Yes. So the first issue, according to Crago, is the fuel tank. Stream of consciousness continues, quote, some say fill it to the brim with non-ethanol petrol, add fuel stabiliser and drive it a short distance before parking up the short drive to ensure dilution of the stabiliser throughout the entire fuel system and the fuel system. The entire fuel and fuel system. Okay, so we're dissolving it into the fuel and then distributing it along the guts of the fuel system, I'm assuming. Sounds plausible. The argument used by these proponents being that a full petrol tank stops condensation forming inside it, thereby removing water corrosion from the equaltion altogether. Yes, I wouldn't want a wet or corroded equaltion. Nobody needs that. Now, whilst the tank in my car is plastic, so not at risk of corrosion itself, I imagine condensation or lack thereof is a good thing, especially when water separates. Spell checker. From the fuel as it does, and thereafter potentially enter fuel lines causing corrosion with one R. Corrosion. That's how they say it down the pub, isn't it? They don't go corrosion. They go corrosion. Also, imagine a full fuel tank will totally immerse with one M. Immerse. Will totally immerse the fuel pump and therefore mitigate risk of corrosion and failure of that component. Maybe, I don't know. Conversely, others say to completely empty the fuel tank. This approach is said to address fuel contamination from the condensation and fuel aging, fuel turning to varnish over time. I don't think the whole fuel turns to varnish over time. I think there's a small proportion of it that might, and polymerise as well, so there's that. Oh, I've watched your recent YouTube video on fuel aging and summarising. I took from it that for quite some time the condition of the fuel, especially when stored in a car's fueled system, F-U-E-L-D, the fueled system, will be just A-OK. However, that for longer periods there is, it's not funny, likely to be a degree of degradation that could be harmful. That degradation. I don't want any other colour than red. Oh, I wonder whether 2 years of storage is in that ballpark of becoming harmful. I think it probably is, maybe. Craig's take on this, which is summarised now, says, I'm at 6s and 7s on this one. Clueless, to be honest, but I am thinking. And that's the main thing, dude. You are thinking. Filling a tank seems sensible for the reasons folks suggest. However, if the fuel pump does fail whilst I'm away, corrosion and or lack of use, I'm left with a full tank of petrol to deal with. I always fail with a full tank, right? I'm not sure that really matters. Don't you go in from the top for most fuel pumps these days? You just go in through the floor, straight into the fuel tank. There's a portal in the floor, you unbolt that, then you get to the top of the tank and you unbolt that, there's your fuel tank. Doesn't matter if it's empty or full, the pump just lifts out. Kind of like being a gynecologist, really. They always fail with a full tank, right? Also reflect on your video about a car's fuel system being pretty much a sealed system, degradation, R-E-D. That's how you know it's not lightning, right? Degradation to the extent of the fuel turning towards varnish over only 2 years seems unlikely, and at best adding an amount of octane booster might be the thing to do when I get back. So let's just drill down into this whole fuel thing in the tank for 2 years, because the way to approach this is to put your applied physics and chemistry hat on to the extent that you ever wore one, right? And I'd suggest that a fuel tank is not like, here we go, bottle of acetone, right? It's not like a bottle of acetone with the lid done up where there's zero evaporation except into the vapour space on top, right? Vapour on top, liquid on the bottom, closed system. But it's also not this, right? Because if you do this, the acetone or the petrol, whatever, will just evaporate over time, right? So a fuel tank is kind of in the middle, but it's closer to being closed than it is to being open. It's got this thing called evap venting, which basically stops the fuel tank, it stops the atmospheric pressure outside the fuel tank from crushing the fuel tank as you consume the fuel by allowing air in a controlled way. Okay, and then if hypothetically you fuel up on a really cold day and you overfill the car and then you go and park somewhere and the temperature rises because the sun comes up and bakes the car, then you don't want the fuel tank to burst because of the pressure inside it. So you need it to vent positive pressure outside as well as negative pressure to vent in towards the tank. So you need flow in both directions when a sufficient pressure differential exists. And that's why it's got evap venting. Okay, so there's a lot of air coming into a tank when you drive and you consume fuel and the tank empties. So you might be sucking in a lot of air operationally. But when the car is stopped in a relatively controlled environment with not all that much temperature variation, because it's not being parked in direct sunlight and it's not being parked outside where frost is on it in the winter, for example. It's in a much more sort of, controlled environment than that. So there's not going to be all that much venting. But here's a thought experiment that I did preparing this answer, okay? If you figure out how much water 70 litres of air can actually hold, because the volume of a VY tank is 71 litres. So let's just say 70 litres of air is the maximum sort of amount of air you'd have in the tank. And if we pick the wettest possible air with relative humidity at 100% and quite a high ambient temperature, like 35 degrees or something, and you go and do the whole applied physics thing there and figure out exactly how much water there can be in 70 litres of air in that hot, humid, sticky. This is like the hottest, humidest, sticky air at 35 degrees C. If you just pump that into the fuel tank, that air has 2.8 grams of water in it, okay, which is 2.8 millilitres. It's less than 1/10 of a shot glass, okay? That's the maximum amount of water that can come out of that volume of air. So even if then the tank cools to 0 degrees, right, so the freezing point of water, not all of the water is going to fall out of the air. Only about 2.4 grams of water is going to fall out at 0 degrees. To get like 97 or 98% of the water out of the air, you have to cool it down to minus 45 degrees C or something. So tipping that's not going to happen, right, while the car is sequestered in this way. What I'm saying is that the maximum risk of precipitation in that extreme example where you pump the tank full of the hottest, humidest ambient air imaginable and then freeze it to 0 degrees C, it's like 2.4 millilitres of water, okay? So let's just put that in perspective. And then even if you say, well, with that evap venting over 2 years, we make a rational sort of estimate, evidence-based estimate for how much flow might occur in and out of the tank in that time. And let's say it's, I don't know, a cubic metre or 1.5 cubic metres or something. Then, and we assume that only the hottest, most humid air at 35 degrees C is coming in, which is very unlikely, like Fantasy Island, right? Because we're not going to be sucking hot air into the tank, are we? We're generally going to be sucking cold air in because that's just how this works. It gets colder outside and then that cools the tank down. The pressure drops and we're sucking cold air in. But even if by virtue of some magic we're still using that ridiculously hot and ridiculously humid air, then we're really only talking about, at the absolute extreme of possibility, about 60 grams of water, which is 60 millilitres or 2 shot glasses. And it's inconceivable that it would be that high. It's more likely to be, I don't know, 5 or 10 millilitres or something. But the most it could possibly be in the most vile, hellscape of hot, humid air ingestion for the whole time can only ever be 2 shot glasses of water getting in there, okay? More likely 5 or 10 millilitres. So the risk of condensation being significant in a storage context is extremely low. And of course, one thing you could do, and it's not a bad idea with a lot of cars, is just to fit a fuel water separator plenty of quality aftermarket joints will sell you a fuel water separator that will prevent any water from going further than the delivery line from the fuel tank, from the fuel pump in the tank, right? It'll catch it there. You inspect it once every 3 months or something, and you just get the water out of it that falls into the trap by opening a bung. So I'd suggest that in a fuel storage context, for the long term, a bigger problem is oxidation of the fuel. And obviously we're not talking about the same sort of oxidation that occurs in the engine, which is combustion. What we're talking about is particular components inside the petrol that are vulnerable to oxidation when they turn into less desirable chemicals that have negative impacts on the fuel system. All right, so I had a little look at the mechanism for that, and there are things like olefins and unsaturated hydrocarbons inside fuel, because although fuel is modelled on octane, it's actually a shandy of all these different hydrocarbons, and these olefins and unsaturated hydrocarbons have a propensity to oxidize, and when they do, they turn into peroxides and hydroperoxides, and they break down into other less desirable chemicals like ketones and aldehydes and some acids as well. So you can sort of see where this is going, okay? Some of those chemicals also polymerize, which means they turn into plastics kind of thing. They turn into long chains of chemicals anyway, and including varnishes and things like that. But they also turn to gum that can clog stuff up. And the biggest risk there, obviously, is when the tightest parts of the fuel system, the fuel lines, the needles on carburetors and injectors, get full of varnish or some jelly-like junk, then that's really bad for the fuel system, right? So you want to avoid that if you can. But I would also suggest that it's a horrible thing to contemplate that you'll leave your car there for 2 years and you come back and the injectors are blocked or something, or, the fuel filter nothing flows through the fuel filter anymore, doesn't start properly. What else can happen? The octane rating can be reduced also because the sort of venting in the fuel tank allows the more volatile fractions of the fuel to just piss off first, and what that'll do is it'll make it harder to start, and it'll also interfere with the octane rating of the fuel, okay? Meaning reduce the octane rating of the fuel, and that'll cause knock or pinging, right? And knock or pinging is kind of okay if it just happens at low load, but if it happens at wide open throttle and big power outputs, it can melt pistons and do all kinds of dogs and cats living together stuff with your engine. It's unlikely to do that when you just start the engine for the first time after 2 years. We'll get to what you should do. I'd suggest, though, that these problems of oxidation and varnish and blocked injectors and reduced octane rating and all of this stuff, they exist. They're a chemical fact, but they're grossly overstated by the retailers and wholesalers of additives as purported countermeasures, okay? So the problem is actually this big, but the way it's presented to you in the marketing documentation is it's like this, okay, when really it's just like that. So here's what I'd do. As a rational countermeasure for all of these problems, if you love your car and you want to do the right thing by it and you want to put it on ice for ages, I would run the fuel in it out until the fuel light comes on, and then I would tip in whatever the amount is that it says on the bottle. I'd get a fuel stabilizer from someone reputable like Newlon or Penrite and read the bottle, put that amount in. If it's 70 litres of fuel, put the amount in for 70 litres, okay? And then fuel up on top, and not with E10, probably not with 98 either. I'd probably refuel with straight 91 or 95 because there's less of an additive package with the lower octane ratings, okay? And they probably oxidize a bit less potentially, so there's that to consider. And then I just drive it for a bit so that the mixed up additive goes all the way down the fuel system to the injectors, right? Because that's really where you want the most stable fuel, okay? And then when you get back, 2 years later, car's got dust all over it, but is otherwise intact, I'd siphon out 60 litres and I'd put in a fresh tank of 98 on top. And that means you're going to need 3 jerry cans to siphon out the fuel that is just there to bulk up the tank, stop quote-unquote condensation and be like a big reservoir of fuel stabiliser, whatever. You've got that there, and then just dispose of it in some sort of environmentally conscious, thoughtful way. I don't know, burn a few witches or something. Just like the olden days. So the next thing that is a problem for Craig is the battery, okay? So Craig goes, one camp says to put a trickle charger and be done with it. This approach, of course, replies upon a power source being available. Yes, it does reply on that, Craigo. The other camp says remove or disconnect the battery. This approach will likely mean a new battery upon my return, but removes the risk of in the electrical fire space. So I'd say, what risk of electrical fire? Like, the biggest risk of electrical fire with vehicles is some muppet does a dodgy modification in the driveway, which is unlikely when you're storing the car. And the next biggest, they fit something and they turn a cable about this thick into a fuse effectively and wonder why the car burns down. So anyway, if you don't do that while the car's on ice, then the next biggest risk of electrical fire is some wire touches the exhaust or something hot and shorts out. And then you've got heat, fuel, and airflow, which is like the unholy trinity of fire. If you've just got your car in a storage space with an extension cord to a charger trickling in 1 amp, we're talking like 14 or 15 watts, which is a very low amount of power. So even if it's 20% efficient, we're talking about 2 or 3 watts of waste heat to be rejected. It's pretty difficult to cause a fire with that. So you could potentially remove the battery and just put it on a trickle charger at a remote location. The ideal storage state for a lead-acid battery is fully charged, okay? So keeping it fully charged is the way to prolong the life of the battery. So Craig's got an hypothesis here, and he says, I'm thinking second might be the safest option. I could always leave the battery at home and have one of my sons charge it from time to time there. Sons with an apostrophe S, of course. However, the car would need to be left unlocked. The factory security system alarm will not work, and I'm concerned the car may drop its program with an apostrophe S when woken up 2 years later. Hate it when anything wakes up and drops its program, Sounds like ex-wife number 4, really, to me. I'd say the obvious thing to do here is leave the battery in the Commodore, fit a smart trickle charger, have one of your sons, apostrophe S, whip past every couple of weeks or once every month or something, just to make sure that the charger is still powered up and nothing's tripped a breaker or otherwise gone awry. Maybe just give the car a quick once-over and make sure that the person with the unit next door hasn't just opened the door and turned it into a chicken coop or something of that nature. The final thing, and we're nearly there, I know, but this stream of consciousness thing is important. And so, if you are going to do that to a car, it's better to be rational than just, figure out whether you think Muzz or Trev on Reddit sound like they're a better option, okay? On the tyres now, Craig goes, one side, he says to put the car on jack stands, remove the wheels and them flat. Lie them flat, I guess. This approach is said to remove flat spotting of the tyres. The other side says to leave the wheels on the car and place tyre keepers under each tyre. Curved wheel chock thingos. This approach is said to remove the issue of tyre flat spots together with eliminating, spell check too, suspension droop that placing a car on stands brings. thereby keeping shock absorbers from fully expanding as the suspension descends under its own weight. Me, I'm thinking the first and feel that taking the wheels off the car, significant weight will be removed at each corner and the remaining weight of the suspension brake components will be effectively managed by the spring, meaning the shock absorber will stay closer to its normal range and won't droop to any extent to cause an issue. Dude, put jack stands under the car by all means, but how about we just jack the car up and put the jack stands under the lower control arms or directly under the damper mounting points so that the tyres are off the deck but the suspension remains compressed. You're welcome. That's the easiest one to solve. And then I guess it makes sense to pump the tyres up to the maximum pressure allowed on the sidewall, because every tyre I've ever seen from every reputable mainstream manufacturer says maximum inflation pressure, maximum cold inflation pressure, 50 psi or something. Just do that. Craig says, and finally, we are there. Is there anything you can think of that I've overlooked adding conditioner to the engine oil soon before parking it up in order to keep the seals pliable? For example, I already do that with Trana, given how rarely it's driven normally. Thanks in advance for your time and your thoughts on the subject. Maybe I'll get to hear my ramblings in your Funi voice. F-U-N-Y. Exactly. F-U-N-Y. Your Funi voice. So, I would say in addition to all that crap, bleed the brakes, because brake fluid is hygroscopic, and that means it absorbs water, and I wouldn't want too much water in there because I wouldn't want to corrode anything in the brake system for 2 years without heating it up and moving it around and doing all of that stuff. And normally I think you'd bleed the brakes within a 2-year operations window anyway, and that's just because the brake fluid absorbs moisture, so do it preemptively, okay? I'd change the oil. I'd do that as one of the last things I did before parking the car up, and that way there would be the fewest number of combustion contaminants in the oil, and therefore the additive package in the oil would be at its best for protecting the engine and related components. I'd top up the coolant just for its own sake, you know. I'd replace the cabin air filter, because one of the things I wouldn't want is a 2-year-old or whatever cabin air filter to start growing its own little culture of black, bloody microbe whatever that's just bad for your health, right? I'd just put a fresh one in there, and then you won't have to worry about a colony of, I don't know, bubonic plague or something, just in your air filter, and then you come back 2 years later, you turn the aircon off, and all of a sudden, you know, biohazard. I would put rat baits in the boot, under the bonnet, and in the cabin of the car, because I just wouldn't want rats in there eating electrical insulation, interior, whatever, foam or carpet. I just don't want rats in there, or in the boot. Nothing good happens when rats sense a nice, quiet, sheltered location, right? It's a good idea to have vermin mesh, as Craig mentioned, on the exhaust to stop rats getting in there, and also the inlet air to stop rats getting in there. What else? I made a big list of stuff here. I checked the engine air filter on return in any case, just to make sure that it hadn't become a haven for wasps or something, because they'll fill it up with that really finely powdered silty mud that they make their freaking nests out of, and you don't want that next to your air filter, obviously. I'd open the cabin air vent, however, because I would want the pressure to remain equalised in and out of the car, just so you don't have some pressure type scenario setting itself up. Not that I think that's a big deal, because the variation in atmospheric pressure is not going to be that great. But anyway, just for completeness, open the cabin air vent and just let the pressure equalise itself, and that'll minimise condensation on the inside and things of that nature. I'd also replace my key fob batteries. I don't know how much of a difference that makes to their operation, but I wouldn't want one of those CR2032 button batteries exploding in the key fob the day after I leave to go off overseas. Dude, know what I'm saying? So I'd leave the handbrake off too, because you don't want that to corrode itself solid locked on. And on the issue of brakes, I would also be mindful when I drive off after restarting in 2 years' time that the brake discs themselves will be quite corroded, and therefore I just want to make sure that the brakes were operationally up to the task of stopping the vehicle before I went out there in traffic, right? Step 1, make sure the pedal is firm. Step 2, brake gently on the way down the driveway to knock the corrosion off, kind of thing. I'd remove the spark plugs. When I park up at the storage facility, remove the spark plugs if that's not such a pain in the arse. I've never done that on an LS3. But if you can remove the spark plugs, I know that CRC and probably other companies as well, but CRC is a very good supplier of products of this nature. They'll do an engine storage protectant spray specifically designed for this job, right? So just pull the spark plugs out, spray a nice liberal dose of that product inside each of the spark plug holes so that you're not leaving any of the bores exposed, right? You don't want them to rust because that can then take the cross-hatching away and lead to scuffing of the pistons on the bores, glazing of the bores, right? And then once you've done the spray once, I would rotate the crank 180 degrees and get the pistons in all of their other opposite positions, and I'd do it all again, right? And then I just screw the spark plugs back in and put the leads back on. That'll stop that from happening. So that's something that a lot of people probably wouldn't think to do. It's probably overkill. But if you've got a couple of classics and you don't want to rebuild the engine prematurely, it's half an hour's work kind of thing. I do this sort of very thorough inspection before restarting or driving, okay? And that would start by just looking under the car and making sure that there wasn't a big pool of something suspicious under there. And then, as discussed, I'd check that the brake pedal's firm, I'd check the air inlet and all of that kind of shit. I'd pull the storage fuel out, or at least 50 or 60 litres of it, and dispose of that on the witches, wherever. And put some nice fresh 98 back in there, and that will compensate for the reduction in octane of any remaining fuel in the tank, right? So that'd be no problem. I'd be checking the tyre pressures, have a look for evidence of rats eating anything, particularly electrical wiring. I'd be letting the car warm up significantly before driving it, and I'd be checking for leaks because who knows, a hose might have perished as you've been parked up, and I would rather figure that out in the driveway than halfway to wherever. I'd be braking quite gently initially just to make sure that the brakes were all polished up and ready to go. And then finally I would get a full service done by a professional shortly thereafter. And some of that stuff is probably overkill. You can probably get away without the fuel stabiliser. You could probably get away without spraying inside the bores. If it's an important car to you and it's like an emotional connection to the culture, which, let's face it, a lot of cars are, then I don't think it really hurts to do that. Some of it's a bit like chicken soup, isn't it? It can't hurt to have the fuel stabiliser in there, and it can't hurt to have the spray inside the combustion chambers. Might not help, but if it gives you some peace of mind, and then have a stern chat to those young blokes about the ill-advisedness of taking the equivalent of Ferris Bueller's mate's dad's Ferrari for a bit of a joyride while you're gone. Have a great time overseas, and I'll look forward to hearing a full report in a couple of years' time when you get back, Craig. And if you ever have mothballed a car or you plan on doing that, let us know what you did if you've done it. And if you're going to do that, I hope this somewhat long-winded but hopefully helpful video actually helps you.